The Battle of Red Cliffs, a turning point in Chinese history. In the bitter winter of 208 CE, nearly 250,000 soldiers stood frozen along China's mighty Yangtze River, their breaths forming clouds in the frigid air. They were about to witness what would become the largest and most consequential naval battle in Chinese history, a clash that would see 800 warships burn on the waters of Red Cliffs. To the north stood Cao Cao, the brilliant but ruthless chancellor who had risen from a mere clerk to command the largest army China had ever seen. To the south, an unlikely alliance between a scholarly aristocrat and a pirate-turned-warlord prepared to make their final stand, their fate resting on an audacious plan involving fire, wind, and the river itself. The battle that followed would not only determine the fate of an empire, but would be retold for over 2,000 years in epic poems, novels, paintings, and films. This is the story of how a vastly outnumbered force managed to destroy Cao Cao's mighty fleet, how nature itself seemed to intervene in human affairs, and how a single night of fire and chaos gave birth to China's legendary Three Kingdoms period. But first, we must understand how the mighty Han Dynasty, after 4 centuries of glory, found itself tearing apart at the seams. Empire of Chaos. The yellow imperial banners that had once flown proudly over China's cities now hung in tatters, their threads unraveling like the empire they represented. In the final decades of the 2nd century, the once mighty Han Dynasty had devolved into a theater of shadows, where child emperors sat powerless on the dragon throne while warlords carved up the realm. Behind the vermilion walls of the imperial palace, a succession of regents and chancellors pulled strings with increasing desperation, each claiming to act in the name of an empire that was slipping through their fingers. Into this maelstrom stepped a man whose name would become synonymous with both brilliance and tyranny. Cao Cao began his career as an unremarkable local constable, the son of a court eunuch's adopted son. His early evaluations described him as clever but untrustworthy, an assessment that would prove prophetic. While other ambitious men fought openly for power, Cao Cao built a network of spies and informants that stretched across China. He cultivated scholars, welcomed talented refugees, and transformed his territory into a haven for the displaced intelligentsia of the crumbling empire. By 200 CE, Cao Cao had managed what seemed impossible. He had captured the young Emperor Xian, becoming the power behind the throne. But rather than claim the crown himself, he exercised power through a masterful manipulation of legitimacy. Every edict he issued, every army he raised, every execution he ordered was done in the name of the puppet emperor. His personal banner bore the imperial dragon, but with a crucial difference: his dragon faced north instead of south, a subtle but powerful message that he was the true force protecting China from the northern barbarians. Yet for all his cunning, Cao Cao faced a problem that had plagued Chinese leaders for millennia: how to control the south. The Yangtze River acted as a natural barrier, its waters protecting the independent southern warlords who refused to acknowledge his authority. In the southwest, the scholarly Liu Bei gathered followers with his vision of restoring the Han dynasty to its former glory. In the southeast, Sun Quan had inherited a domain of skilled naval warriors and merchants who knew every bend and current of the great river. Both men had refused Cao Cao's offers of alliance, knowing they would amount to little more than elegant surrender. As autumn turned to winter in 208, Cao Cao made his decision. He would gather the largest army China had ever seen, a force of nearly 800,000 men according to contemporary records, though modern historians suggest a more likely figure of 220,000. But numbers alone couldn't solve his greatest challenge. Most of his soldiers were cavalrymen from the northern plains who had never set foot on a ship. As his massive army began its southward march, Cao Cao was betting the future of China on his ability to transform land warriors into a naval force capable of crossing the mightiest river in Asia. It would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The strategist's gambit. Through the morning mist that cloaked the mountain paths, a simple wooden cart made its way south. Inside sat Zhuge Liang, a brilliant young strategist whose reputation had grown in whispered conversations among the empire's scattered intellectuals. At 31, he had already refused multiple invitations to serve various warlords, preferring to live in scholarly seclusion. But Liu Bei had convinced him that the fate of China hung in the balance, and now Zhuge Liang was undertaking the most dangerous diplomatic mission of the age, convincing the proud and independent Sun Quan to ally with them against Cao Cao's imminent invasion. The court of Sun Quan bristled with tension when Zhuge Liang arrived. Zhou Yu, Sun Quan's brilliant naval commander, watched the visitor with barely concealed suspicion. Many of Sun Quan's advisors argued for surrender to Cao Cao's overwhelming force. They presented letters from Cao Cao himself, offering generous terms. Sun Quan could keep his lands if he submitted to northern authority. The young ruler's confidence wavered under the weight of these arguments. After all, Cao Cao's army reportedly stretched 1,000 li, over 300 miles, and his newly built navy darkened the Yangtze's waters. But Zhuge Liang had come armed with more than just words. In one of history's most masterful diplomatic performances, he turned Sun Quan's court against itself. Rather than argue directly with those who favored surrender, he praised their wisdom in seeking peace. His voice dripping with feigned admiration, he suggested that such prudent men should quickly accept positions in Cao Cao's administration before the best posts were taken. The implied cowardice of this course stung Sun Quan's pride. When his advisors protested, Zhuge Liang produced intelligence reports detailing Cao Cao's northern army's fatal weakness, their complete inexperience with naval warfare. Zhou Yu, initially the strongest opponent of alliance, found himself nodding as Zhuge Liang spoke. As a naval commander, he understood the enormous difference between river warfare and land battles. The Southerners had spent generations mastering the Yangtze's currents and moods. Their ships were lighter, more maneuverable, crewed by men who had lived their lives on the water. Cao Cao's northern soldiers, however skilled on horseback, would be worse than useless on shifting decks. The debate raged for days until Sun Quan, in a moment of high drama, drew his sword and slammed it into the table before him. "Those who speak of surrender will be treated as those who oppose me," he declared. The alliance was sealed, though Zhou Yu privately warned his lord that trusting Liu Bei, and especially his brilliant strategist, might prove as dangerous as facing Cao Cao. For the moment, however, necessity overrode caution. Combined, the southern forces could muster barely 50,000 men against Cao Cao's massive army. But they had something their enemy lacked: generations of experience in river warfare, and now, thanks to Zhuge Liang's silver tongue, they had unity of purpose. As Zhuge Liang's cart made its way back north through the mountain paths, the wheels of a far greater movement were already turning. In ports and harbors along the Yangtze, Zhou Yu began gathering the ships and sailors that would determine China's fate. The stage was set for one of history's greatest naval battles, though none yet knew the crucial role that fire, wind, and weather would play in the coming struggle. Army of 100,000. The autumn waters of the Yangtze churned under the weight of Cao Cao's massive naval buildup. His newly constructed fleet stretched across the river like a floating city, with supply ships laden with grain and weapons moving between larger war vessels. The northern warlord had requisitioned every boat he could find along the river's tributaries, from fishing skiffs to merchant barges, transforming them into platforms for war. At the heart of his strategy lay a critical decision. He ordered the ships chained together to create stable platforms for his cavalry-trained soldiers, effectively turning the river into a floating extension of land. The transformation of Cao Cao's northern horsemen into naval warriors proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Many had never seen ships larger than river ferries, and seasickness plagued the ranks. The soldiers struggled with the basic tasks of naval warfare, loading artillery, maintaining balance during archery practice, and coordinating movement between vessels. In a moment of frustration, one of Cao Cao's advisors observed his troops stumbling on the deck and whispered, "My lord, we cannot fight fish with cavalry." Yet Cao Cao pressed forward with characteristic determination. He appointed Cai Mao, a defector from the south with naval experience, to train his forces. Cai Mao suggested an innovative but risky solution to the troops' instability on water: chain the ships together in groups of 50 to form floating fortresses. These massive formations would provide stable platforms for archers and reduce the impact of waves. The strategy seemed sound in theory, but it sacrificed the key advantage of naval warfare mobility. The sound of hammers echoed across the water as thousands of iron chains were forged and attached between vessels. Cao Cao's engineers developed an intricate system of connecting the ships, with specialized units assigned to maintain the formations. The resulting fleet was an awesome sight, hundreds of ships bound together into massive floating islands of war. Even experienced river captains who saw the assemblage were struck by its scale and ambition. No one had ever attempted naval warfare on this scale in Chinese history. But as autumn deepened, troubling reports reached Cao Cao's command post. His naval officers warned of the southeastern winds that would soon sweep up the Yangtze. These seasonal gales could spell disaster for ships chained together, as the force that affected one vessel would be transmitted to all those connected to it. Cai Mao's brother, Cai He, suggested they wait for spring. But Cao Cao, conscious of his army's dwindling supplies and the risk of giving the Southern Alliance more time to prepare, dismissed these concerns. "The southeast wind," he reportedly scoffed. "It will bow to my ambition like everything else." As his massive fleet began its final preparations, a small boat slipped away in the night. On board was a messenger carrying detailed information about the Northern Fleet's preparations, including its fatal vulnerability to fire. The message was bound for Zhou Yu's headquarters, where the southern commanders were about to devise a strategy that would turn Cao Cao's floating fortresses into his army's funeral pyre. Masters of the river. Zhou Yu stood at the prow of his flagship, watching his river veterans demonstrate naval maneuvers that had been passed down through generations of Yangtze warfare. His ships danced across the water in intricate formations, their crews moving with the practiced grace of men born to the river. These were not conscripted farmers or converted cavalrymen. They were the inheritors of South China's maritime traditions, descendants of pirates, merchants, and fishermen who had navigated these waters since childhood. Among Zhou Yu's most experienced commanders was Huang Gai, a scarred veteran of countless river battles. While Cao Cao's forces were still learning to walk on shifting decks, Huang Gai's crews were perfecting the art of swimming fire, a devastating tactic that involved swift ships loaded with flammable materials. The preparation was meticulous. Huang Gai's men coated their ships' hulls with oil and filled their holds with dry reeds soaked in fish oil. Below decks, they prepared multiple layers of kindling, positioned to create a conflagration that would spread rapidly but give the crew enough time to escape. The Southern Fleet's training sessions took on an almost theatrical quality. ships would appear to break formation, feigning disorder and retreat. But these apparent mistakes were carefully choreographed deceptions, designed to lure enemy vessels into fatal positions. Zhou Yu's crews practiced these maneuvers until they could perform them in darkness, guided only by whistle signals and the feel of the current beneath their keels. A pivotal moment came when Huang Gai approached Zhou Yu with an audacious proposal. He would present himself to Cao Cao as a defector, bringing with him a small fleet of surrendered ships. The plan was breathtakingly dangerous. If Cao Cao's commanders detected the ruse, Huang Gai would face a death of unimaginable torture. Even success would require him to sail into the heart of an inferno. Zhou Yu, recognizing both the plan's brilliance and its terrible risk, performed a ritual of brotherhood with Huang Gai before witnesses, swearing that if the veteran commander did not return, Zhou Yu would care for his family as his own. As preparations continued, Zhou Yu received intelligence that proved decisive. Cao Cao's fleet had chained their ships together in massive groups, a fatal mistake that transformed them from a navy into a series of floating targets. Even more crucially, their crews were suffering from severe seasickness, with some ships reporting half their soldiers incapacitated. The southern commanders could barely contain their grim satisfaction. They had trained for years to fight the river's motion. Cao Cao's troops couldn't even stand on their own decks. In the final days before battle, the southern fleet conducted one last drill. Under the cover of darkness, they practiced coordinated movements guided only by torch signals. The maneuvers were complex and dangerous. One mistimed turn could send ships crashing into each other. But as Zhou Yu watched his fleet move like shadows through the night, he knew they were ready. The only remaining question was whether nature itself would cooperate with their plans. Everything now depended on the direction of the wind. Nature's fury. In the pre-dawn hours of a winter morning, a weathered fisherman named Kong Ming made his way through the southern camp to Zhou Yu's command post. His arrival was no accident. The southern commanders had specifically sought him out for his legendary ability to predict the southeastern wind. After studying the clouds, the water's surface, and the behavior of river birds, Kong Ming made a prediction that would change Chinese history. The southeastern wind, vital to the fire attack's success, would begin to blow near sunset the following day. Zhou Yu immediately summoned his commanders. While warriors like Huang Gai understood combat and strategists like Zhuge Liang grasped politics, Kong Ming understood something far more ancient and powerful: the Yangtze's moods. The southeastern wind was a natural phenomenon that occurred regularly during winter months, driving up the river with tremendous force. If Kong Ming was right, nature itself would soon become their most powerful ally, carrying their fireships directly into Cao Cao's chained fleet. Through the morning, the southern forces made their final preparations under an unusually still sky. The air hung heavy and motionless, creating a tension that even the most seasoned veterans felt in their bones. Huang Gai's defection would need to be timed perfectly. Too early, and Cao Cao's forces might discover the ruse. Too late, and they would miss the wind. Zhou Yu ordered his troops to begin visible preparations for a retreat, adding credibility to Huang Gai's imminent surrender. By midday, observers on both sides noted an unsettling change in the wildlife along the river. Flocks of birds suddenly took wing, heading northwest. Fish began jumping unusually close to the surface. The old river hands in Zhou Yu's army nodded knowingly. These were the signs that had preceded every major southeastern wind they'd witnessed. In Cao Cao's camp, these same signs were either missed or misunderstood by commanders more familiar with the movements of cavalry than the language of rivers. As the sun began its descent, the first hints of the wind appeared as ripples across the water's surface. In Zhou Yu's camp, sailors touched their foreheads to the deck in silent prayers to the river gods. The wind began as a whisper, then steadily grew stronger, surging up the Yangtze just as Kong Ming had predicted. Zhou Yu, standing at his command post, felt the growing force of the gale and allowed himself a brief, grim smile. The southeastern wind had arrived with such force that the flags of both armies stood stiff in the gathering darkness. For the northern army, the wind's arrival brought increasing discomfort. Their chained ships began to pull against their moorings, the iron links creaking ominously. Cao Cao's C6 soldiers, already struggling with the river's motion, found their misery compounded by the strengthening gale. None of them yet realized that this wind, which seemed merely an inconvenience, would soon become an instrument of their destruction. As darkness fell, the stage was set for one of the most spectacular naval engagements in military history, the night that would become known as the Battle of Red Cliffs. Night of Burning Ships. As dusk settled over the Yangtze, Huang Gai began his approach toward Cao Cao's fleet. His small squadron of defecting ships moved slowly through the gathering darkness, their decks piled high with supposed grain tribute for the northern army. Each vessel had been carefully prepared, their holds packed with oil-soaked reeds, their crew compartments filled with kindling, their decks subtly painted with flammable resins. The southeastern wind howled across the water, so strong now that it churned the river into white-capped waves. In Cao Cao's command post, the news of Huang Gai's defection was met with triumphant celebration. The veteran commander's reputation was so formidable that his surrender seemed to validate all of Cao Cao's strategic decisions. When Cao Cao's naval advisors suggested searching the ships before allowing them to dock, their concerns were dismissed. After all, what threat could a few grain ships pose to the mightiest fleet ever assembled on the Yangtze? The moment of ignition was marked by a single drumbeat echoing across the water. In an instant, Huang Gai's grain ships erupted into floating infernos. Their crews, who had rehearsed this moment countless times, quickly transferred to small boats hidden beneath the larger vessel's sterns. The southeastern wind, now at its peak strength, drove the burning ships directly into the heart of Cao Cao's chained fleet. The fire spread with terrifying speed, leaping from ship to ship along the iron chains that were meant to be the northern fleet's strength. Panic erupted among Cao Cao's forces. C6 soldiers, already disoriented, found themselves trapped on burning ships. The same chains that stabilized their vessels now prevented escape. As commanders shouted contradictory orders, some crews attempted to unfasten the iron links, but the growing inferno made this nearly impossible. The heat became so intense that, according to contemporary accounts, the iron chains glowed red in the darkness. From his command post on the southern shore, Zhou Yu watched as the conflagration transformed night into day. The flames, driven by the relentless wind, created their own weather system. Contemporary accounts describe a fire hurricane that consumed everything in its path. The river itself seemed to boil, its surface covered with burning debris and desperate swimmers. The screams of trapped soldiers mixed with the roar of the flames and the cracking of timber, creating what one witness described as the sound of 10,000 devils wailing. By midnight, Cao Cao's mighty fleet had become its own funeral pyre. The vessels that managed to break free from the chains found themselves at the mercy of the southeastern wind, which drove them back into the burning mass. Those ships that survived the initial conflagration were picked off by Zhou Yu's river veterans, who darted through the chaos in small, fast boats, launching fire arrows at any northern ship that appeared salvageable. The Battle of Red Cliffs, one of the most decisive naval engagements in history, was won in a single night of fire and fury. But for Cao Cao's retreating army, the worst was yet to come. Rout at Red Cliffs. The mighty Yangtze, normally a silvery expanse at first light, was black with ash and dotted with smouldering wreckage. The remnants of Cao Cao's once magnificent fleet drifted aimlessly in the current, their charred hulls steaming in the cold morning air. But while the naval battle had ended, the true slaughter was about to begin on land. Cao Cao's surviving forces had no choice but to retreat north through an area known as the Huarong Road, a treacherous path of muddy tracks that wound through marshland and heavily forested hills. The winter rain had transformed the ground into a quagmire, and Cao Cao's army, already exhausted and demoralized, found itself literally sinking into the earth with each step. The heavy cavalry that had been Cao Cao's pride now became a deadly burden, their horses becoming trapped in the deep mud. Zhou Yu and Liu Bei's forces, intimately familiar with the terrain, split into small, mobile units that attacked the retreating column from all sides. The narrow path prevented Cao Cao's superior numbers from being deployed effectively. Soldiers who stepped off the road to avoid attacks found themselves trapped in the swamp. The scene, described in contemporary accounts, was apocalyptic war horses drowning in mud, soldiers throwing away their armor to move faster, abandoned weapons and supplies stretching for miles along the path. At a crucial choke point along the Huarong Road, Cao Cao's remaining forces encountered an unexpected figure. Guan Yu, Liu Bei's sworn brother and most feared general, had positioned his troops to cut off the retreat. What followed was one of the most famous moments of Chinese military history. Cao Cao, who years earlier had shown kindness to Guan Yu, faced his former benefactor across the muddy track. The warrior, renowned for his commitment to honor and righteousness, faced a moral dilemma that would be debated for centuries. After a tense moment, Guan Yu stepped aside, allowing Cao Cao and his immediate bodyguard to pass, an act of mercy that would have profound consequences for China's future. The retreat became a race against time and nature. The winter rain continued relentlessly, and diseases began spreading through the ranks of Cao Cao's army. Historians estimate that barely a third of his massive force made it back to northern territory. The army that had set out to conquer the south had been utterly broken, not just militarily, but psychologically. The myth of Cao Cao's invincibility, carefully built over decades of victories, had been shattered in a single campaign. As Cao Cao's bedraggled army limped back north, he was heard to quote an ancient poem, "Fortune and disaster are like twisted strands of rope." His dream of reunifying China under his rule had gone up in flames at Red Cliffs, and the empire would remain divided for generations to come. The battle marked not just the end of a campaign, but the beginning of China's Three Kingdoms period, an era that would become legendary for its military adventures, political intrigues, and the larger-than-life characters who shaped it. The night of burning ships had changed the course of Chinese history forever. Epilogue: Three Kingdoms, Rise. In the decades that followed the Battle of Red Cliffs, China crystallized into three distinct realms, each claiming to be the true inheritor of the Han legacy. The decisive battle had not just saved the South from conquest, it had fundamentally altered the political geography of ancient China. Where Cao Cao had dreamed of unity, his defeat ensured division would become the new reality. In the north, Cao Cao abandoned his dreams of complete conquest and instead focused on consolidating his hold over the heartland of China. His domain, which would become the state of Wei under his son, was the most populous and agriculturally rich of the three kingdoms. He turned his military genius to diplomatic purposes, transforming his territory into a haven for scholars and artists. In a final, ironic twist, the man who had failed to conquer China through force would succeed in making his territory the cultural center of the age. Sun Quan's kingdom of Wu flourished in the southeast, its prosperity built on naval power and trade. The rivers that had helped him defeat Cao Cao became highways of commerce, connecting his realm to distant lands. Zhou Yu's ships sailed as far as Southeast Asia and India, creating a maritime empire that would influence Chinese naval traditions for centuries. The descendants of the river warriors who had helped win the Battle of Red Cliffs became merchants and explorers, their fighting skills gradually transformed into seafaring expertise. Liu Bei's kingdom of Shu, established in the southwest, became legendary for its commitment to Han legitimacy and Confucian values. With Zhuge Liang as his strategist, Liu Bei created a state that would be remembered as the most righteous of the three kingdoms, though not always the most practical. The scholar general would continue to shape Chinese military thought long after his death, his strategies studied by commanders for generations. The Battle of Red Cliffs entered Chinese culture not just as a military engagement, but as a parable about the power of wisdom over brute force, of skill over numbers. The story was retold countless times, reaching its literary pinnacle in the 14th century epic Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The battle became a central metaphor in Chinese strategic thinking, referenced by leaders facing overwhelming odds throughout history. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Red Cliffs lay in how it shaped China's understanding of itself. The battle demonstrated that China could exist as multiple states while maintaining a unified cultural identity. This concept of political division within cultural unity would resurface repeatedly in Chinese history, influencing how later generations understood their nation's cycles of division and reunification. The Night of Burning Ships had not just changed China's political map, it had transformed how the Chinese people understood their own civilization. As the embers of Cao Cao's fleet cooled in the waters of the Yangtze, none of the participants could have known that their actions would resonate through 2 millennia of history. The Battle of Red Cliffs, born from the chaos of a dying dynasty, had given birth to an age of heroes whose names would never be forgotten. The fire that destroyed a fleet had illuminated a path into legend,